The gun pressed cold and deliberate against Homer Sheridan's temple had been placed there by a man he had trusted, and the only thing standing between him and a bullet was a woman who had no earthly reason to save him. Theodora Merriweather did not flinch. She stood in the doorway of her apothecary with a jar of linseed oil in one hand and absolute fury in her dark brown eyes, staring down Marshal Caleb Voss like she had been rehearsing this confrontation her entire life. The late afternoon sun of Redemption Creek, Texas cut hard shadows across the dusty Main Street, and the whole town had gone utterly silent, the kind of silence that meant everyone was watching but no one was willing to move. "You pull that trigger, Caleb Voss," Theodora said, her voice low and steady as a river current, "and you will answer to me before you answer to God." Voss laughed, but it was a shallow sound. He kept the gun against Homer's temple, his knuckles pale against the grip. "This man is a wanted outlaw, Miss Merriweather. Step back inside your shop and mind your remedies." Homer Sheridan had not moved. He was kneeling in the dirt of Redemption Creek's Main Street, wrists bound behind him with a length of rough rope, his dark hat knocked sideways and a cut bleeding freely above his left eye. He had ridden into this town 3 days ago with no intention of being seen by anyone. He had come here to disappear, to let the name Homer Sheridan dissolve quietly into the dust of some forgotten corner of the Texas frontier, where the law could not find him, and neither could the men who wanted him dead for reasons that had nothing to do with justice and everything to do with betrayal. He had not counted on her. He had not counted on Theodora Merriweather seeing through him on the very first afternoon, when he had walked into her apothecary with a shoulder wound. He had tried to dress himself and made a complete disaster of the job. She had looked at him then with those steady, knowing eyes, and instead of screaming for the marshal, she had simply said, "Sit down before you fall down, and tell me how bad it really is." Now, 3 days later, she was the only thing standing between him and a bullet, and Homer felt something crack open in his chest that he could not afford to examine right now. "Miss Merriweather," he said quietly, not moving, not wanting Voss's finger to tighten on the trigger, "go back inside." "You be quiet," she told him firmly, and then she looked back at Voss. "That man has not caused one moment of trouble in this town. He has paid for his meals, he has kept to himself, and whatever crimes you think he committed happened somewhere else to someone else, and you do not have the jurisdiction to drag him into the street and put a gun to his head like a common executioner. You are supposed to be the law, Caleb. Start acting like it." Something moved in Voss's expression, a flicker of calculation, and Homer cataloged it instantly. The marshal was not operating out of pure legal duty. There was something personal here, something dark and dangerous coiled beneath the surface of Voss's professional demeanor, and Homer recognized it the way a man recognizes a rattlesnake by its stillness more than its noise. The story of how Homer Sheridan had come to be kneeling in the dirt of Redemption Creek, Texas, on a hot afternoon in the autumn of 1882, was not a simple one. It was a story built on layers of forced choices, hidden motives, and a dark past that had followed him across 3 states like smoke follows fire, never quite letting him go far enough ahead to breathe clean air. Homer had been born in Missouri, the youngest son of a farmer who worked himself to an early grave and left 4 boys with nothing but land that the bank owned more of than they did. He had been 20 years old when he first crossed the line from law-abiding citizen to outlaw, and the circumstances of that crossing were the kind that made a man understand, viscerally and permanently, that justice and the law were not always the same thing. A man named Garrett Voss, elder brother to Marshal Caleb Voss of Redemption Creek, had robbed the savings of half a county through a fraudulent land scheme in 1875. Homer's family had been among the dozens ruined. When Homer had gone to the law had done nothing. When he had gone to a judge, the judge had been in Garrett Voss's pocket. When he had gathered evidence and testimony and brought it to a federal agent, that agent had disappeared, and Homer had found himself accused of the agent's disappearance, a crime he had not committed but could not disprove. The years between 1875 and 1882 had made Homer Sheridan into many things: a man who could ride hard and far, a man who could keep secrets, a man who had done things that were wrong even when they were done for reasons that felt righteous. Because that was the kind of trap that a dark past set for you. You kept trying to correct the original injustice, and you kept stepping deeper into the mud, until one day you looked down and could not see your boots. He had ridden with a group of men for a while, not exactly an outlaw gang in the dime novel sense, but men who operated outside of sanctioned authority, who took from those who had taken first and distributed what they could to those who had nothing. It had felt like justice for a few years. Then it had started to feel like something else. The thing that had finally broken Homer loose from that life was a robbery gone wrong in Lubbock County, a robbery he had refused to participate in because the target was a supply wagon carrying food and medicine meant for a Comanche reservation, and his companions had gone ahead without him, and 3 people had died, and Homer's name had been attached to it anyway because he had been seen with those men in the weeks prior. He had run. Not because he was cowardly, but because there was no court in Texas that would hear the distinction between being present at a crime and committing one, not with his name already attached to a stack of warrants that Garrett Voss's money had helped manufacture over the years. Running was not noble. Homer knew that. But it was survival, and survival was what he had left when everything else had been stripped away. He had ridden south and east and eventually found himself on the outskirts of a small town called Redemption Creek, which he had chosen purely because the name struck him as either a terrible joke or a genuine invitation, and at that point in his life he was tired enough to take it either way. His plan had been simple: find a room, keep his head down, let the dust settle, move on before anyone recognized him. He had been meticulous about it, wearing plain clothes instead of the dark coat everyone described in the wanted posters, keeping his hat low, taking his meals early in the morning or late in the evening when fewer people were around. The shoulder wound had ruined the plan. He had taken the wound 2 weeks before arriving in Redemption Creek, a ricochet off a canyon wall when a bounty hunter had found his camp and opened fire without announcing himself first. Homer had dealt with it as best he could, cleaned it, wrapped it, kept riding, but the wound had gone sour somewhere along the trail, and by the time he reached Redemption Creek, his whole left arm had been burning with the particular angry heat of an infection that was not going to resolve itself. He had walked into Theodora Merriweather's apothecary on a Tuesday afternoon because it was on the end of the main street and because he had told himself he would just buy some carbolic acid and fresh linen and handle it himself. She had taken one look at him, at the careful way he held his arm and the slight pallor beneath his tan, and she had said those words that had undone him entirely. "Sit down before you fall down. Tell me how bad it really is." He had told her it was a graze. She had told him that grazes did not typically cause a man's lymph nodes to swell the way his were, and had he considered that he might lose the arm if the infection was not properly addressed. He had sat down. Theodora Merriweather was 31 years old and had been running the apothecary in Redemption Creek for 4 years, having inherited it from her uncle Bertram, who had trained her in the practical science of medicines, compounds, and wound treatment from the age of 16. She had read every medical text she could acquire through the postal system and 3 separate booksellers in San Antonio, and she had also, over 4 years of frontier practice, developed a clinical instinct that went beyond anything she had read, the ability to read a person's body and face and voice, and understand what they were not telling her. She was not a formally trained physician. There were no women formally trained as physicians anywhere near Redemption Creek in 1882, and the nearest actual doctor was 40 miles south in a larger town called Carver's Bend. But Theodora had treated wounds, fever, broken bones, complicated childbirths, and every variety of the ailments that frontier life produced, and she had lost fewer patients than the doctor in Carver's Bend, which was a fact she did not speak aloud but was quietly proud of. She was also, by the standards of Redemption Creek, a somewhat unconventional woman. She had never married, which at her age prompted a certain amount of comment from the town's more traditional residents. She had opinions about the Comanche removal, and about the treatment of Chinese railroad workers, and about the land monopolies that kept small farmers in perpetual debt, and she expressed those opinions when asked and sometimes when not asked. She kept a rifle behind the counter of her apothecary and knew how to use it. She had looked at Homer Sheridan on that Tuesday afternoon and seen a man carrying secrets the way other men carried saddlebags, heavily and with constant awareness of the weight. She had seen the shoulder wound and the infection and the careful way he watched the door, and she had made a decision that she would examine later and found she could not entirely explain even to herself. She had decided to help him. She had cleaned the wound with carbolic solution, which had caused Homer to grip the edge of her examination table so hard the wood creaked, and she had packed it with medicated gauze and told him to come back the following day, and she had not asked his name. He had volunteered it on the second visit, which surprised her. Most men carrying obvious secrets did not volunteer names that might be recognized. Homer Sheridan, he had said, watching her face carefully. She had kept her expression professionally neutral while her heart rate increased by what she estimated was about 20 beats per minute. She knew that name. Everyone within 500 miles who read newspapers knew that name, or at least knew a version of it. The wanted posters described him as armed and dangerous, an outlaw connected to the Lubbock County incident, a man with a long history of criminal activity stretching back to Missouri. She had looked at him, this quiet man who had said please and thank you and had not tracked mud on her clean floor and had flinched when she hurt him and apologized for it. And she had thought about everything she knew about how wanted posters got made and who made them and whose interests they served, and she had said, "I see. Is the arm feeling any better today?" That had been yesterday. And now he was kneeling in the dirt of Main Street while Caleb Voss pressed a gun against his head, and Theodora was in the doorway with a jar of linseed oil and a decision already made. "Voss," she said again, stepping down off the boardwalk into the street, "lower that weapon and do this properly. You want to take him in, take him in. Write up a warrant, send a telegram to the county seat, do the legal thing. But you are not going to shoot an unarmed man in the street while I am standing here watching." "The man is a wanted criminal," Voss said, but the gun hand was not as steady as it had been 30 seconds ago. "The man is accused," Theodora corrected, "which is not the same as convicted. And I am a witness to everything happening right now, and so are about 15 other people hiding behind their curtains." She said that last part louder, addressing the curtained windows and closed doors along the street, and she heard a shift in the collective held breath of the town. She was not wrong. Redemption Creek was a small enough town that its residents would watch a spectacle and be shaped by it, and she was betting that Voss was not so far gone that he wanted the town to watch him execute a kneeling man. Caleb Voss lowered the gun, not all the way, not holstered it, but lowered it to his side, and his expression had shifted from cold authority to something harder to read. "I am taking him to the jail," he said. "Fine," Theodora said. "And I will be at the jail within the hour with a copy of the relevant law regarding prisoner medical treatment, because that arm is not fully healed, and I will not have it neglected." She watched them go, Voss marching Homer toward the small building at the far end of the street that served as both the marshal's office and the jail, Homer walking steadily despite the ropes and the blood still trickling from the cut above his eye. At the door of the jail, Homer turned and looked back at her, just for a moment, and the expression on his face was one she had not seen on a man's face in a very long time. It was not gratitude exactly, though that was part of it. It was something more raw and more complicated, something that looked like a man confronting the unexpected. Theodora went back into her apothecary, set down the jar of linseed oil, and allowed herself exactly 30 seconds of shaking hands before she straightened her back, collected her medical bag and her copy of Texas criminal procedure law, and went to do what she had said she would do. The jail was a simple structure, adobe brick with a barred window and a single cell in the back separated from Voss's office by an iron door. Homer was in the cell when she arrived, sitting on the narrow cot with his wrists finally freed and the cut above his eye not yet addressed. Voss was at his desk, writing something. "I need to see to my patient," Theodora said, setting her bag on the desk without being invited to do so. "Your patient is a criminal," Voss said, not looking up. "Your opinion about his character does not supersede his medical needs under the law," she said pleasantly. "Section 42 of the Texas Criminal Procedure Code, which I have here if you would like to read it." Voss looked at her then, a long, measuring look that contained something Theodora recognized as a particular kind of masculine irritation at being outmaneuvered by a woman. She had seen it many times. She met it with polite, immovable calm. "Fine," he said. 10 minutes. She went to the cell. Homer stood when she came to the bars, which was a courtesy she noticed. "I told you to go back inside," he said. "You did," she agreed, setting down her bag and opening it. "I have never been particularly good at doing what I am told." Something shifted in his expression, something that might have been the beginning of a smile. "I noticed that." She cleaned the cut above his eye through the bars, working efficiently, and she examined his shoulder through the gap between the bars, checking the wound for signs that the infection was fighting back against the treatment. It looked acceptable, better than it had actually. "Is he going to keep you here long?" asked quietly, her voice low enough not to carry to Voss's desk. "He has sent a telegram," Homer said, equally quiet. "Probably to a bounty man he knows. Voss has been hunting me for 2 years. This is not about law enforcement. His brother is Garrett Voss." She processed this in silence for a moment. "Garrett Voss, the landman." Homer's eyes met hers through the bars. "You know about him?" "I read newspapers," she said, "and I have had patients who lost land to him, a family named Alcott. Lost everything and were gone by the winter of '76. She paused. "Is that where your trouble started?" The silence that followed was not empty. It was the kind of silence that was full of things being considered, trust being weighed, the calculation of what it cost to let someone see the truth versus what it cost to carry it alone. "My family lost land to Garrett Voss," Homer said. 1875. I tried to go through proper channels. That did not work out. And then I made choices that were not all wise ones," he said. "But I did not do what the worst of those posters say I did." She looked at him for a long moment. "The Lubbock County thing." "I was not there," he said. She believed him. She could not have explained precisely why, except that she had spent 4 years reading the faces and bodies of people who were in pain, and she had gotten very good at the difference between truth and performance, and this was truth. It had the particular quality of something that had been carried a long time, worn smooth by handling. "I am going to find out more about this," she said. "Do not cause any trouble tonight." "Miss Merriweather," he said, a note of dry disbelief in his voice, "I came to this town specifically to not cause trouble." "I know," she said, closing her bag. "And yet—" She left the jail and went home to her small house behind the apothecary, where she sat at her writing desk until nearly midnight, composing careful letters to 2 people. The first was to a former patient of hers who had become a journalist in San Antonio, a sharp-minded woman named Frances Calloway who had contacts within the Texas court system. The second was to a retired federal judge named Ambrose Hatch who had corresponded with Theodora once about a land dispute involving one of her suppliers, and who had, in that correspondence, expressed opinions about Garrett Voss that were distinctly unfavorable. She was not a lawyer. She was not an investigator. But she was methodical, and she was stubborn, and she had 4 years of experience navigating the complicated informal systems by which small frontier towns actually ran, and she was not willing to let a man be shot or worse, because his enemies had been more patient than his defenders. She was also, and she acknowledged this with the same clinical honesty she applied to everything, interested in Homer Sheridan in a way that went beyond professional duty. This surprised her. She had not been interested in a man in that particular way for several years, not since a man named Charles Beaumont had courted her seriously for 8 months, and then revealed that what he had actually wanted was access to her uncle's property deed, which had been a cold and educational experience. She had concluded from it that she was perhaps better suited to independence than partnership, and she had been comfortable with that conclusion. Homer Sheridan was different in ways she was still cataloging. He was quiet without being closed. He was careful without being cold. He had, on his second visit to her apothecary, noticed the photograph on her shelf of her Uncle Bertram and asked about it without being prompted. And when she had told him the story of Bertram teaching her the trade, Homer had listened with the particular quality of attention that was genuine rather than performative. He had not offered opinions about whether women should or should not be doing what she was doing. He had simply listened and then said with complete sincerity that her uncle must have been a good teacher. She had thought about that for the rest of the day. The following morning she went back to the jail with fresh dressings for Homer's shoulder and a breakfast plate from the hotel dining room that she told Voss was required for proper medical recovery, and watched him decide not to argue about it. She sat outside the cell on a straight-back chair while Homer ate, and she kept her voice low. "I have written 2 letters," she said. "They will go out on today's mail stage." Homer set down his fork. "You should not do that. I have already done it. Theodora." Her given name in his mouth, for the first time, and it was said with a weight of concern that made her breath catch just slightly. Caleb Voss is not a man to cross lightly. His brother has resources. If you get in the middle of this, you become a target. "I am already in the middle of it," she said. "I stepped into the middle of it yesterday afternoon in front of 15 witnesses and one very annoyed marshal." Homer was quiet for a moment. "Why?" he asked, and it was a genuine question, stripped of everything except honest bafflement. She considered how to answer that honestly. "Because I looked at you and I saw a man who needed help," she said. "That is what I do. It is what I am trained to do. And I am also," she added, meeting his eyes directly, "someone who believes that the difference between a criminal and a man who has been unjustly pursued for years is a distinction worth fighting for." He looked at her for a long time, and she watched something move through his expression that was complicated and deep, something she could not entirely read but recognized as significant. "Most people would not take that risk for a stranger," he said. "You are not entirely a stranger anymore," she said. "And I am not most people." "No," he agreed very quietly, "you are decidedly not." She left before the silence could become something she was not ready to navigate, and she went about the business of her day with the particular focused efficiency of a person who is thinking hard about something and funneling that energy into practical tasks. Redemption Creek was a town of approximately 400 souls in 1882, a cattle route town that had grown around a reliable water source and a junction of 2 freight roads. It had a hotel, a general store, 2 saloons, a small church, a blacksmith, a telegraph office, a livery stable, and Theodora's apothecary. The population was predominantly white, with a smaller community of Mexican families who had been in the region far longer than any of the white settlers, and were generally treated with the casual dismissiveness that Theodora found morally unacceptable, and said so when the topic arose. The marshal's authority in a town this size was considerable. Caleb Voss had held the position for 3 years and was generally regarded as effective, if somewhat severe. What the town did not know, or perhaps had chosen not to examine too closely, was the degree to which his brother Garrett's interests shaped Caleb's decisions. Theodora had suspected this for some time, in a vague, unverified way. Homer's confirmation of it moved it from suspicion to established fact in her mind, and changed how she thought about the situation entirely. The bounty man Voss had telegraphed arrived on Thursday, which gave Theodora 2 days in which she worked harder than she had worked on any single cause since arriving in Redemption Creek. Francis Calloway's response by return telegraph was better than Theodora had hoped. Francis had contacts in the circuit court in Lubbock County and had been doing her own investigative journalism on land fraud in Texas. She had, in fact, a file on Garrett Voss that included testimony from 3 witnesses placing him at the scene of various fraudulent transactions, and she had been building a case to publish for the better part of a year. She had also been in contact with a federal marshal named Reed who had been quietly investigating the 1875 land scheme and several subsequent crimes. A federal marshal whose interest was very much in Garrett Voss, not in Homer Sheridan. Judge Hatch's response by letter was slower, but he had included a document in his first reply that arrived by the Friday mail stage. A letter on judicial stationery stating that the warrants outstanding against Homer Sheridan contained procedural irregularities that a competent court would need to examine before any extradition could proceed. She brought that letter to the jail on Friday morning and presented it to Caleb Voss with the calm satisfaction of someone who has done their research correctly. Voss read it twice. His expression went through several things. "Where did you get this?" "Judge Ambrose Hatch of the Ninth Circuit," she said. He was kind enough to respond promptly. "You cannot just contact federal judges on behalf of a prisoner." "I did not contact him on behalf of a prisoner," she said sweetly. "I contacted him as a private citizen with concerns about legal procedure. Judge Hatch has jurisdiction over concerns about legal procedure." He responded accordingly. Voss stood up, and he was angry, a deep-seated angry that she recognized now as personal. "Miss Merriweather, I do not know what that man has told you, but he is dangerous." "He told me very little," she said. "Everything I found out through my own research. And what I have found out is that the warrants against him have significant procedural problems, and that the man who originated most of them, your brother Garrett Voss, is himself the subject of federal investigation." She paused. "I imagine you knew that last part already." Voss went very still. "The bounty man you have coming," she continued, "will not be able to legally remove Homer Sheridan from this jail on the basis of those warrants, not with Judge Hatch's letter on record. If you attempt to let him do so anyway, you will be participating in what amounts to an unlawful detention and transfer, and I will ensure that Judge Hatch and Federal Marshal Reed are both informed of the specifics within 48 hours. She left the letter on his desk and walked out. Outside, she stood on the boardwalk in the bright October morning and let herself breathe. The cottonwood trees along the creek at the edge of town had gone yellow, their leaves catching the light like small pieces of fire. She could hear the blacksmith working and somewhere a dog barking, and the ordinary sounds of the town going about its ordinary life felt strange against the extraordinary tension she was carrying. She went to the jail window, the barred window on the side of the building that let in the morning light, and she said quietly, "Homer." His face appeared at the bars, and she could see from his expression that he had heard some of what passed inside. The walls were thin. "Judge Hatch's letter is on Voss's desk," she said. "The bounty man cannot legally remove you, but Voss is going to look for another way, and I do not know how long the legal protection will hold." "Theodora," Homer said, and the way he said her name had changed somehow, had acquired a quality that made her chest feel tight. "You have done more for me in 4 days than anyone has done in 7 years. I want you to understand that I see that. I see what it has cost you." "It has not cost me anything yet," she said. "It will," he said very quietly. "Voss will not forget this." "Neither will I," she said. She looked at him through the bars, this man who had come to her town to vanish and had instead been pulled into the most visible situation possible, and she thought about the strange trajectories of things, how sometimes a person arrived somewhere intending one thing and found something else entirely, and how that something else could be more real than any plan they had come with. "When this is resolved," she said, keeping her voice steady, "what will you do?" He was quiet for a moment. "I do not know," he said honestly. "I have been running so long that I am not sure I remember what not running looks like." "It looks like staying," she said, "if you have a reason to." The silence between them then was different from all the previous silences. It was the silence of something that had been named carefully and without pressure, and was now alive in the air between them, waiting to be acknowledged or set aside. "Is that an offer?" he asked, very carefully. "It is an observation," she said, equally careful. "The offer part would come later if everything else works out." He held her gaze through the bars, and there was something in his face that she had not seen there before, something open and almost raw, like a door that had been locked for a very long time and had just found the right key. "Then I will hold on to the observation," he said. She nodded once and went back to work. The bounty man arrived Thursday afternoon as predicted, a lean, weathered man named Cord Fitch who had been following Homer's trail across 2 states and who presented his paperwork to Voss with the efficiency of long practice. Fitch was not a cruel man by reputation, simply professional, someone who operated within legal frameworks and made a good living doing so. Theodora had positioned herself in the marshal's office before Fitch arrived, on the grounds that she needed to examine her patient, which was true. When Fitch laid out his papers, she was sitting in a chair in the corner with Judge Hatch's letter in her lap, and she waited for Voss to produce it. Voss produced it, though the look he gave Theodora while doing so could have etched glass. Fitch read the judge's letter carefully, asked 2 questions about its provenance, and then set his own paperwork down with the resigned expression of a man who knows when a legal situation has become more complicated than his fee is worth. "I will need to consult with the circuit court," Fitch said. "If the warrants have procedural defects, I cannot take him until they are resolved." "That could take months," Voss said. "That is how legal processes work," Fitch said, with the calm of someone who did not particularly care either way. He looked at the letter again. "This judge's name carries weight. I am not going to step in front of a Ninth Circuit judge for the sake of a single bounty." He left the next morning, and Theodora allowed herself precisely 5 minutes of quiet relief before beginning to think about what came next. What came next was Caleb Voss, becoming something more dangerous than a marshal with a grudge. He was now a man whose plans had been repeatedly interrupted by the same woman, and whose brother's interests were suddenly at risk of federal scrutiny, and Theodora's assessment of the threat had been correct when she had told Homer about it through the jail window. On Friday evening, someone broke the front window of her apothecary. She was in the back room when it happened, the sharp explosion of breaking glass bringing her upright from her chair, and she came through the door with the rifle from behind the counter already in her hands. The street outside was empty, the glass glittering on the floor in the lamplight, and a rock the size of her fist sat in the middle of it. There was nothing tied to the rock. It did not need a message. It was the message. She swept up the glass. She boarded the window frame with plank wood from the storage shed. She did not sleep well, but she slept, because she was not willing to let a broken window be the thing that broke her. Saturday morning she went to the jail and found Homer standing at the cell door waiting for her with an expression that she recognized as barely controlled. He had seen the boarded window from the cell's barred exterior window, which faced the side of the apothecary. "I know," she said before he could speak. "This is what I was afraid of," he said. "Theodora, please. I am grateful for everything you have done, more grateful than I have words for, but I cannot be the reason you are harmed." "You are not the reason," she said. "Caleb Voss is the reason, and his brother, and the entire system that let them operate this way for years." She set her bag down. "How is the shoulder?" "The shoulder is fine," he said with a frustration that was entirely endearing. "I am talking about you." "I know what you're talking about," she said, "and I am telling you that I have handled worse. I have been in this town for 4 years, and I have had to fight for my right to operate this business and be taken seriously, and not be told to wait for the doctor in Carver's Bend when people are dying in front of me. A broken window is not going to unmake what I have built here." He looked at her for a long time. "You are the most stubborn person I have ever met," he said. "My Uncle Bertram said the same thing," she replied, checking his shoulder with practiced efficiency. He meant it as a compliment. "So do I," he said quietly. The week that followed was a careful, complicated dance of legal procedure and personal tension. Theodora's letter to Francis Calloway had set in motion something larger than she had initially anticipated. Francis had already been in contact with Federal Marshal Reed, and Reed had been waiting for precisely the kind of corroborating witnesses and documentation that Francis's investigation was producing. The file on Garrett Voss was growing. What Theodora had not anticipated was that Garrett Voss himself would come to Redemption Creek. He arrived on a Tuesday, 10 days after Homer's arrest, driving a fine black carriage that was entirely out of place on Redemption Creek's main street, a heavy-set man in his 50s, with the well-maintained look of someone who had been comfortable for long enough that comfort had become a kind of armor. He went directly to the marshal's office, and Theodora, watching from her newly reglassed apothecary window, felt the situation shift into a new and more dangerous configuration. She had a decision to make. She could wait and see what Garrett Voss was planning, or she could act first. She chose to act first. She composed a telegram to Francis Calloway and sent it from the telegraph office, simple and direct. "Garrett Voss has arrived in Redemption Creek. Whatever you have, please move quickly." Then she went to the jail. Voss the elder was there when she arrived, which she had expected. He was a man who projected authority the way a fire projected heat, oppressively and without consideration of who it was burning. He looked at her when she came in with the assessing look of someone who is accustomed to understanding people's value at a glance. "You must be Miss Merriweather," he said. "I am," she said pleasantly. "I have heard about the trouble you have been causing my brother," he said. "I have not been causing trouble," she said. "I have been ensuring that legal procedures are followed correctly. Some people find that troublesome, but that is generally because they have reason to fear correct legal procedure." Garrett Voss's eyes went cold and calculating. She held his gaze without difficulty. She had treated dying men and frightened children and people in the deepest pain a body could produce, and she had learned that fear was something you felt, acknowledged, and then set aside when the work required it. The work required it now. "Miss Merriweather," he said, with the careful tone of a man offering something, "my brother is a good marshal. This town has been well served by him. It would be a shame if his career were disrupted by interference from a woman who does not understand the full picture." "I understand a great deal of the picture," she said, "and I am willing to discuss what I understand with Federal Marshal Reed when he arrives, which I expect will be within the week." That landed. She watched it land. Garrett Voss did not change his expression much, but she saw the slight tightening around his eyes that told her she had hit something real. "You are making enemies you cannot handle," he said, and the pleasantness was entirely gone now. "I am standing in a jail where I have every legal right to be," she said. "To examine a patient I have every professional right to treat, if you will excuse me." She went to the cell and did not look back at Garrett Voss, though she was acutely aware of his presence behind her. Homer was watching her with an expression of mingled admiration and alarm, and she gave him a small, steady look that she hoped communicated, "I'm all right, stay calm, I know what I am doing." She was not entirely sure she knew what she was doing, but she was committed. Garrett Voss left the jail without another word to her, and she heard the creak of carriage wheels as his driver moved the horses. She let out a breath she had been holding. "You just told Garrett Voss that a federal marshal is coming," Homer said quietly. "Yes. That was either very smart or very dangerous." "Both, probably," she said. "But if he knows Reed is coming, he has two choices. He can run, or he can try to do something drastic before Reed arrives. If he runs, that is its own kind of evidence. If he tries something drastic, he will be doing it in front of witnesses." Homer shook his head slowly, but she could see the reluctant respect in it. "Theodora," he said, "I want you to be careful tonight." "I will sleep with the rifle," she said. "That is not as reassuring as you think it is," he said. She slept with the rifle. Nothing happened during the night, which made her more uneasy rather than less. because she understood that nothing happening could mean the danger was being organized rather than abandoned. Federal Marshal Calvin Reed arrived 2 days later, not on the stage but on horseback, alone and without ceremony. A lean, quiet man in his late 40s who identified himself to Theodora when she was opening the apothecary in the morning with a badge produced from his inside pocket and a level look. "You are Miss Merriweather," he said. "Francis Calloway spoke highly of you." "Come inside," she said. They talked for an hour, and Theodora gave him everything she had. The timeline of Homer's arrest, the procedural irregularities in the warrants, Judge Hatch's letter, her own account of Garrett Voss's visit to the jail, and everything Homer had told her about the 1875 land scheme and its aftermath. Reed listened with the quiet precision of someone who is assembling a picture from many pieces and already has most of them. "Homer Sheridan is not the target of my investigation," Reed said at the end. "He has not been for some time. The warrants with his name on them are largely a nuisance created by Garrett Voss to keep him running and prevent him from testifying. I have been trying to get those warrants reviewed for 2 years. Then why does he still have them?" Theodora asked, though she suspected the answer. "Because Garrett Voss has interests in 2 courts that have been slow to process the review," Reed said. "Judge Hatch's letter goes around that problem. That is good work." "What happens now?" she asked. "Now I go to Marshal Voss's office," Reed said, "and I have a conversation about federal jurisdiction." What followed was the most tense 48 hours Theodora had experienced in Redemption Creek, and she had experienced some tense situations. Federal Marshal Reed's conversation with Caleb Voss produced a visible result. Voss went quiet, which was not the same as going away, and his brother's black carriage stayed at the hotel rather than leaving, which meant Garrett was calculating rather than fleeing, and Theodora kept her rifle close and her eyes open. The resolution came in a way she had not precisely predicted, though she had prepared for it. On the second night after Reed's arrival, someone attempted to remove Homer from the jail without legal authority, using a key that should only have been in Marshal Voss's possession. The 2 men who made the attempt were ranch hands employed on a property connected to Garrett Voss's land holdings, and they were intercepted in the jail's small back corridor by Calvin Reed, who had been sleeping in the office at the marshal's desk precisely because he had anticipated something like this. Nobody was shot, which Theodora was grateful for. One of the ranch hands had a broken wrist from the altercation, which she treated the following morning with the professional neutrality she maintained for all patients regardless of her feelings about them. The other had a split lip and a great deal of fear in his eyes, which she assessed as appropriate given the situation. Garrett Voss was arrested that morning. Caleb Voss was suspended from his position pending investigation, his badge taken by Calvin Reed with the minimum of ceremony and the maximum of legal precision. And Homer Sheridan, on a bright Thursday morning in late October of 1882, walked out of the Redemption Creek jail a free man. Theodora was across the street when he came out, standing in the doorway of her apothecary, and when he saw her he stopped on the boardwalk in front of the jail and they looked at each other across the dusty width of the main street for a long moment in which the whole town seemed to breathe. He crossed the street. He walked directly to her, and he stopped in front of her, and the morning light was full on his face, and she could see all the things in it that he had been carrying, the exhaustion and the relief and something new and fragile that he was offering her with the careful hands of someone who had been hurt enough to know the cost of carelessness. "You did that," he said, "all of it." "We did it," she said. "You gave me the information I needed." "I gave you one conversation through jail bars," he said. "You did the rest." She looked at him. "Are you going to leave?" she asked, and she kept her voice steady because she was not ready for him to hear what was underneath the question. "I told you," he said. "I have been running so long I do not know what not running looks like." He paused. "You said it looked like staying, if there was a reason." "And is there a reason?" she asked. "You know there is," he said. The silence between them now was completely different from all the previous silences. It was full rather than empty, warm rather than careful, and Theodora felt something in her chest open the way a window opens onto the first good day after a long winter. "You need somewhere to stay," she said. "The hotel would be the appropriate suggestion. Or, he said, and there was the beginning of a smile in it. Or you could stay," she said, "here, in Redemption Creek. There is a building 3 doors down that used to be a surveyor's office. It has been empty for 6 months and the owner is looking to sell or rent, and Redemption Creek does not have anyone who can fix a wagon wheel or repair tack without sending to Carver's Bend, and you look like a man who knows his way around a harness." He looked at her for a moment. "You have thought about this?" "I think about everything," she said. "It is a habit." He looked at the building 3 doors down, and then he looked back at her, and the smile had made it all the way to his face now, which changed it entirely, gave it a warmth and a particularity that she realized she had been wanting to see since the first day he had sat on the edge of her examination table and gripped the wood while she cleaned his wound. "I would need a stake to start a business," he said. "I know the owner of the bank," she said. "He owes me a favor. I set his wife's broken arm last year and refused payment." Homer laughed, a genuine, surprised laugh that she felt all the way through her, and it occurred to her that she had not heard him laugh before, and that it was one of the best sounds she had encountered in recent memory. "Theodora Merriweather," he said, "are you rescuing me again?" "I prefer to think of it as providing resources and leaving the decision to you," she said primly. "The decision," he said, his voice gentler now, "is not a difficult one. I would like to stay. I would like to stay in this town and build something real and be someone that deserves to be in the same street as you." He paused. "Whether or not anything more comes of that, I want you to know that the staying is not contingent on it. I am not trading a future in Redemption Creek for whatever you might be willing to offer. I am saying that this place, and the person who lives in it who saw me when I was trying not to be seen, is a reason to stop running on its own." She looked at him for a long moment, and she thought about the shape of her life over the past 4 years, how she had built something real and useful and good, and how it had also been, in certain quieter ways, somewhat solitary, and how the solitude had been her choice and she had been content with it. But contentment was not the same as the particular aliveness she had felt every day of the past 2 weeks. "Come have breakfast," she said. "There is a good place at the hotel that does eggs and coffee and actual bread, not hardtack. And then we will go talk to William Dunbar at the bank, and then we will go look at that building." He offered his arm. She took it. They walked up the street together in the October morning, and it was a small and ordinary thing that felt like the beginning of something very large. The months that followed were the gradual, organic construction of a life, which was less dramatic than a crisis and more deeply satisfying than anything Theodora had experienced. Homer rented the surveyor's building with a small loan from William Dunbar, who turned out to be genuinely pleased to have a skilled tradesman in town, and he set up a workshop that within 6 weeks was doing good business in harness repair, wagon work, and basic blacksmithing. He had a gift for the work that went beyond mere competence, a precision and attention to detail that showed in everything he made, and the ranchers and freighters who depended on their equipment quickly spread the word that there was a good man 3 doors down from the apothecary. He and Theodora moved toward each other the way that careful, thoughtful people do, not in a rush, and not without some navigating of the complicated territories that both of them carried. Homer had a dark past that he was honest about, not in a confessional way, not in a way that was designed to invite forgiveness or pity, but matter-of-factly, as a person who has made choices and understands them and is living with them. He told her about Missouri and about his family and about the years of running, and she listened with the same quality of attention she gave everything, complete and without judgment. She told him about her life too, about the years studying under her Uncle Bertram, about the failed courtship of Charles Beaumont and what it had taught her, about the loneliness and the pride of building her practice in Redemption Creek, about the opinions she held on the treatment of the Comanche and the Mexican families and the Chinese workers, and all the other people that the frontier's version of progress had ground under. And Homer listened to all of it with the quiet intensity of someone who recognized a kindred consciousness. Their first proper dinner together was at the hotel on a Saturday in November, a formal affair by Redemption Creek standards, which meant clean clothes and a tablecloth, and they sat across from each other and talked for 3 hours about everything from medical theory to the politics of water rights to whether the town needed a proper school. And Theodora thought, somewhere in the second hour, that she had never felt this comfortable with another person outside of her Uncle Bertram's company. Their first kiss happened on a cold evening in December, when Homer walked her home from the monthly town meeting and stopped on the step of her back door and said, with the careful honesty that was characteristic of him, "I would very much like to kiss you, and I want to ask first because I think asking is the right thing to do." She had thought, very briefly, about all the reasons that caution was wise, and then she had thought about how tired she was of being exclusively cautious, and she had said yes. The kiss was brief and warm and entirely right, and afterward they stood on the step in the cold December dark for a long moment, and Homer said, in a slightly wondering tone, "I have not done that in a very long time." "Neither have I," she said. "It was good." "Yes," he agreed. "It was." He had been in Redemption Creek for 3 months by Christmas, and the town had accepted him with the practical pragmatism of a frontier community that valued useful people over complicated histories. Not everyone knew the full story of his past, but enough of the story had circulated, carried by the particular informal telegraph of small-town gossip, that most people understood he had been on the wrong end of a bad situation rather than a straightforward villain. The fact that Caleb Voss had been suspended and Garrett Voss arrested on federal charges had reconfigured the town's understanding of several things, including who the real danger had been. Federal Marshal Calvin Reed had been thorough. Garrett Voss's trial in the spring of 1883 revealed the full scope of the land fraud, which turned out to have victimized close to 200 families across 3 counties over nearly a decade. The restitution proceedings were complicated and partial, as such proceedings always were, but they were something, and the families who had lost land and savings had at least the satisfaction of seeing the man who had robbed them face actual consequences. Homer had testified at that trial, which had required a trip to San Antonio, and a week of legal proceedings that Theodora had insisted on accompanying him to, because she was not willing to let him face that particular ordeal alone, and because she had her own testimony to give regarding what she had witnessed in Redemption Creek. They had traveled together by stage, which was uncomfortable, and stayed in San Antonio at a clean boarding house near the courthouse, and spent their evenings walking along the river in the mild spring air. It was on one of those evenings, sitting on a low stone wall above the San Antonio River while the city moved around them and the light went golden and then pink and then purple, that Homer said something he had been building toward for months. "I have been thinking about what I want," he said. "Not just the day-to-day of the shop and the town, what I actually want." "Tell me," she said. "I want to stay in Redemption Creek permanently," he said. "I want to build the business properly, maybe hire help eventually. I want to be the kind of person that a place like that can be proud to have." He paused. "And I want to do that with you if you are willing. Not because you rescued me, not out of gratitude, but because you are the person I want to build it with. Because you are the most honest and the most brave and the most genuinely good person I have encountered in my life, and because I am in love with you, Theodora. Completely and without any reservation." She sat with that for a moment, feeling the warm solidity of it, the realness of it, the way it settled into the space that had been quietly ready to receive it. "I am in love with you too," she said simply, "completely and without reservation." He looked at her and the expression on his face was the one she had been cataloging since the beginning, that door-opening expression, but it was wider now, fully open, nothing held back. He reached over and took her hand, and they sat on the wall above the river while the last light faded, and it was entirely perfect. They married in September of 1883, a year after Homer Sheridan had ridden into Redemption Creek with a festering shoulder wound and a plan to disappear. The ceremony was held in the small church, conducted by Reverend Alderman, who had been in Redemption Creek longer than anyone, and who married people with the no-nonsense warmth of a man who had seen enough frontier hardship to value human happiness without sentimentality. The whole town came, or nearly all of it. Frances Calloway came down from San Antonio, laughing and bright-eyed, and full of the news that her series of articles on Garrett Voss's land fraud had been picked up by 3 papers in addition to her own, making it one of the most widely read pieces of investigative journalism in the state that year. Judge Ambrose Hatch sent a letter with a warmth to it that surprised Theodora pleasantly. Even Federal Marshal Reed sent a brief, formal note of congratulation that Theodora suspected had cost him some significant personal effort, being a man not naturally inclined toward sentiment. Homer wore a dark coat that Theodora had selected for him at the general store, and she wore a dress of deep blue wool that she had ordered from a dressmaker in San Antonio months in advance, and they stood in front of Reverend Alderman and the assembled town, and said the words with a completeness and a sincerity that made several of the older women in the front rows, the ones who had initially been skeptical of Theodora's involvement in the jail crisis, reach for their handkerchiefs. After the ceremony, there was a gathering at the hotel, with food provided by most of the town's households contributing something, the great collective generosity of a small community that had decided to celebrate. Homer danced with Theodora and was, she discovered to her delight, a surprisingly good dancer, which he credited to a winter in Missouri when he was 19 and had had nothing to do but attend every social gathering within 20 miles. "You could have mentioned that earlier," she said, slightly breathless from a reel. "I was saving it as a surprise," he said, and grinned. They began their married life in Theodora's house behind the apothecary, which was modest but sufficient, and which Homer added onto over the following years with a practical competence that extended from harness work to carpentry with the same precision he brought to everything. He built a proper bedroom addition in 1884, a kitchen expansion in 1885, and a porch that ran the full width of the front of the house in 1886, on which they sat together on warm evenings and watched the sky over the Texas plain go through its magnificent changes. The business prospered. Homer hired a young man named Eduardo Vila from one of the Mexican families at the edge of town, a clever and hardworking 18-year-old who turned out to have a natural gift for metalwork, and the shop expanded accordingly. Eduardo became a genuine partner in the enterprise over the years, not merely an employee, which Homer formalized in a written agreement that was unusual enough in 1885 to attract some comment, and which Homer dealt with by explaining calmly to anyone who objected that Eduardo had earned it, and that was the end of the discussion. Theodora's practice grew as well. The doctor in Carver's Bend retired in 1884, which meant that Redemption Creek and the surrounding area needed her more than ever. She sent away for every new medical publication she could find, corresponded with physicians in San Antonio and Dallas, and in 1886 made a trip to the new medical school at Tulane, where she attended a series of lectures and demonstrations that significantly expanded her understanding of infection and surgery. She came back with a case full of new instruments, and new knowledge, and Homer met her at the stage with such uncomplicated, unself-conscious pride in her, that she stood on the boardwalk after stepping down and held his face in her hands and kissed him right there on the main street of Redemption Creek, to the considerable amusement of several passers-by. Their son was born in March of 1885, a healthy, emphatic baby boy who arrived at 4 in the morning in the way of people who would turn out to be inconveniently energetic their whole lives. Theodora had prepared for the birth with characteristic thoroughness, having made prior arrangements with a midwife from the Mexican community named Senora Vasquez, who had delivered more babies than Theodora had treated patients. And between the two of them, the birth was managed with a competence that Homer, who spent the hours in the kitchen trying not to wear a hole in the floor with pacing, later described as miraculous. They named the boy Bertram, after Theodora's uncle, which Homer had suggested first, which had made her love him with a sudden fresh intensity that she had not entirely expected even after 2 years of marriage. Bertram Sheridan was a very definite person from his earliest days, loud and curious and thoroughly in love with the world, and with his parents and eventually with Eduardo Vila's youngest sister, a girl named Lucia who was brought to the workshop with her family on various occasions, and who regarded baby Bertram with the forthright assessment of a 7-year-old who has opinions about things. When Bertram was 4, a daughter arrived, Clara, who was quieter than her brother but sharper, who watched everything with Theodora's steady, cataloging eyes and Homer's precise attention to detail. She was the sort of small child who takes apart things carefully to understand how they work, and then puts them back together better, and Theodora recognized in her early the particular quality that makes a scientist or a physician. Redemption Creek grew through the latter years of the 1880s, as most frontier towns either grew or died during that period, pulled by the railroad and the cattle economy. The railroad came through in 1887, which changed everything. The town doubled in size within 18 months, new businesses arrived, new families settled, new complications and new opportunities multiplied. Homer expanded the shop significantly in response to the railroad, which created enormous demand for metal and mechanical work, and took on 3 additional workers, all of them local men, and one of them, a young black man named Samuel Greer who had come up from the Gulf Coast looking for work, who Homer hired on the spot after watching him solve in 20 minutes a problem with a wagon wheel that had stumped the other workers for 2 hours. Samuel Greer became one of the most skilled metal workers in the county, and Homer Sheridan's reputation for hiring people on the basis of their ability rather than anything else became one of the defining characteristics of the business. Theodora opened a second, larger room of the apothecary in 1888, which allowed her to see patients more efficiently, and she took on an apprentice of her own, a young woman named Adela Torres, daughter of one of the Mexican families, who had shown the same kind of natural medical intelligence that Theodora recognized from her own early years. Teaching Adela was one of the great pleasures of the period, and also a way of ensuring that Redemption Creek would have good medical care beyond her own career. The past did not entirely leave them. Homer's name appeared occasionally in news reports related to the ongoing restitution proceedings from Garrett Voss's conviction, and once, in 1886, a newspaper out of Dallas published a piece about the case that included a brief and not entirely accurate summary of Homer Sheridan's history. Theodora wrote a detailed correction to the newspaper's editor that the editor, wisely, published in full. Homer read it and told her it was the best writing he had ever read, and she told him he was biased, and he said yes, completely and without apology. Caleb Voss left Texas after his suspension was investigated and resulted in a formal censure rather than criminal charges, which Theodora thought was insufficiently just, but which was the reality of how such things resolved. He was not heard from again in Redemption Creek. The Alcott family, the one Theodora had mentioned to Homer through the jail bars in those early days, came back to Texas in 1887. Some of the restitution from Garrett Voss's conviction included land reclassifications that allowed families like theirs to make legitimate claims. Theodora helped navigate the paperwork. Homer vouched for the family's character in the county records, and the Alcotts settled 15 miles outside of Redemption Creek on land that had originally been taken from them over a decade before. Their eldest daughter, A young woman named Martha, who was 23 and had been a child when the family lost everything, became Adela Tor's closest friend, a friendship that seemed to Theodora like a small and specific repair in the fabric of what had been torn. On an evening in October of 1888, 6 years to the month since Homer had first ridden into Redemption Creek with a plan to disappear, Theodora sat on the wide porch Homer had built and watched the last light move across the plain, and listened to the sounds of the house behind her. Bertram's 3-year-old sister Clara talking firmly to a wooden doll about something medical, Bertram himself helping Homer in the yard with a project involving a length of wood and a great deal of earnest consultation, Eduardo Vila and his wife Maria, who had married 2 years before, laughing about something on the path from the workshop. Homer came and sat beside her after a while, his shoulder against hers in the familiar way of people who have been beside each other long enough to fit, and they watched the sky together. "Do you know what I was thinking about today?" he said. "Tell me," she said. "That first afternoon," he said, "when I walked into your shop and you looked at me and said, 'Sit down before you fall down.'" She smiled. "You looked terrible." "I felt terrible," he said. "I had been running for months and I was sick and I was so tired of it. And I walked into your shop and you looked at me and you did not see the wanted man. You saw the sick one, and you offered to help." "It is what I do," she said. "I know," he said, "but it changed everything, Theodora. That moment. You asking if I needed help. It was the first time in years that someone had asked that without an angle to it, without wanting something, without it being part of some calculation. Just a person asking another person if they needed help." She thought about that. She thought about herself at that moment, the clinical instinct that had told her to help and the deeper, less rational thing underneath it that she had not fully understood until much later. "I think I saw something in you that I recognized," she said. "Not the trouble, just the person inside it." He took her hand, the familiar weight and warmth of it. "I want a third child," he said, which was not what she had expected him to say next, and she turned to look at him. "Where did that come from?" she asked. "I have been thinking about it for a while," he said. "Clara is growing so fast, and I like our family. I want more of it." She considered this with the same methodical honesty she brought to everything. She was 38, which was not impossible but was something to be thoughtful about. Her practice was busy. The house, even with Homer's additions, was not enormous. "Talk to me more about this," she said. They talked about it for most of an hour, sitting on the porch while the stars came out over the Texas plain, and what emerged from the conversation was not a quick decision, but a genuine meeting of minds, which was how their best decisions had always been made. She was cautious about the medical aspects. He was sensitive to that caution and not dismissive of it. They agreed that they would talk to a physician in San Antonio whose opinion Theodora trusted. They agreed that if the answer was cautiously positive, they were willing to try. Their second son, James, arrived in the spring of 1890, a smaller baby than Bertram had been and quieter, who fixed his serious dark eyes on his parents with an expression of ancient evaluation that made Homer laugh and Theodora observe that he already looked like he was preparing to have opinions about everything. James proved accurate to this first impression. He was a quiet and deeply thoughtful child who read everything he could find, and who, from a very young age, had a particular passion for plants and growing things that led Theodora to begin teaching him the botany of medicines from the time he could walk reliably. He became, in later years, the person in Redemption Creek who knew more about medicinal plants than anyone else, a knowledge that connected both his parents' worlds in a way that seemed entirely fitting. Bertram grew up to be a blacksmith and a rancher, inheriting Homer's workshop partnership with Eduardo, and eventually taking it over with Eduardo's son Miguel, a third-generation enterprise that became one of the most respected metalworks in that part of Texas. He was loud and good-natured and genuinely kind, and he eventually married a woman from the Alcott family, completing a circle that Theodora found poetically satisfying. Clara Sheridan went to school in San Antonio, and then to a women's college in the East, and came back to Texas as one of the first formally trained female physicians in the state, setting up a practice in a larger city, but coming home to Redemption Creek every summer, bringing with her an increasingly long series of books and medical journals and observations about the world that made the dinner table conversations some of the finest intellectual experiences of her parents' later years. The town of Redemption Creek changed and grew, and changed again through the 1890s and into the new century. The frontier era properly ended, replaced by something more settled and more complicated in different ways. The railroad brought progress and also brought the particular flattening that progress sometimes imposed on the particular character of smaller places. But Redemption Creek kept something of its original quality, the quality of a place that had been shaped by the specific people who lived in it, and some of those people had left marks that would not be erased. Adela Torres became the primary medical provider for the Mexican community, and eventually for the wider community too, expanding the apothecary into a genuine clinic. Samuel Greer's children established themselves as respected citizens of the town, with the same thoroughness their father had brought to metalwork. The Alcott land produced good cattle and good grain, and Martha Alcott became a teacher and then a school principal who educated 2 generations of Redemption Creek children. And in the house behind the apothecary, which had grown gradually over the years into a comfortable, slightly rambling structure full of books and medical instruments, and the accumulated evidence of a busy and useful life, Homer and Theodora Sheridan grew old together in the particular way of 2 people who have chosen each other with full knowledge and no illusions. They argued sometimes, because they were both strong-minded people with opinions, and because disagreement in a household of genuinely thinking people is inevitable and healthy. They argued about the management of the expanded clinic, and about the best approach to a complicated land use question before the town council, and about whether the new sheriff hired in 1895 had sufficient judgment, and about any number of other things that mattered to them because their world mattered to them. They resolved their arguments the way they had always resolved the harder things, by talking until the truth of what each of them thought was fully visible, and finding the place where those truths could rest together. They did not argue about the essential things. They never doubted the choice they had made in each other. Homer, who had come to Redemption Creek as a man who had been running so long he had forgotten what it felt like to stand still, found that staying had given him back something he had lost so early he had almost stopped believing it existed. The sense of being rooted, of being known, of mattering to a specific place and the specific people in it. The darkness of his past became what it always becomes when met with genuine love and genuine time, not erased, but no longer the most important story. His history was part of him, and the man he had become was larger than his history, and Theodora had seen that before he had. Theodora, who had spent her adult life being competent and independent, and somewhat armored against the particular vulnerability that love required, found that the armor had been replaced by something better, not softer exactly, but more honest, more alive. She had always been good at her work. With Homer, she discovered that she was also good at being loved, which is a different skill and one she had not known she lacked until she found it. On an evening in the last year of the century, 1899, Homer and Theodora sat on the porch of the house that had grown and changed with them, and the 3 children were all grown and gone to their various lives, and the town of Redemption Creek spread out beyond the edge of the yard in the warm end-of-summer dusk, familiar and alive. Homer was 52 years old, with gray in his dark hair and the permanent evidence of years of outdoor and physical work in the set of his hands. Theodora was 48, her dark hair threaded with silver, still practicing medicine with the same fierce competence she had always brought to it, still writing letters to people in positions of authority when she thought they needed to hear something they were avoiding. "We should get a dog," Homer said. She looked at him sideways. "What?" "The house is quiet with the children gone," he said. A dog would help. She thought about this with the seriousness she brought to most proposals. What kind of dog? Something large enough to be useful, he said, small enough to fit through the door. That is a very broad specification, she said. I trust your judgment on the details, he said, which made her smile. They got a dog the following week, a large, friendly creature of uncertain ancestry that James named before taking the stage back to San Antonio, declaring it Marcus, which was a very serious name for an animal that spent its first 3 months eating everything in reach and sleeping on Homer's feet. Marcus became a fixture of the household with the same uncomplicated permanence of everything else they had built together. Another thread in the fabric of a life that was large and real and entirely theirs. In 1882, Homer Sheridan had ridden into Redemption Creek, Texas, with his hat pulled low and an infection in his shoulder, and every intention of never being seen by anyone. He had come to disappear, to let himself dissolve into the dust of a forgotten corner until the world forgot his name. Theodora Merriweather had seen him anyway, through the window of her apothecary, and had recognized not the outlaw the wanted posters described, but a man who was in pain and needed help. She had asked if he needed it. He had said he was fine. She had told him to sit down before he fell down. And the rest had been the whole of what mattered, built carefully and lovingly, and with full knowledge of all the complicated, difficult, wonderful truth of who they both were, in the good red dust of Redemption Creek, Texas, under a sky that went on forever, over a land that was worth all the fighting they had done for it.